Flight, at one time a long sought-out dream of humanity, is now an everyday reality. From compact wingsuits to multi-ton commerce and combat planes, non-powered and powered flight contraptions have given us access to a realm once thought only available to the gods. But was 1903 really the first controlled flight in history? Of the countless centuries which have passed, is it really possible that the Wright brothers were the only ones in all of human existence to ever conceive of and create a large, winged conveyance capable of carrying people? This seems highly unlikely. But is there any real evidence to support this dubiety? In this study, we will consider some ancient relics and concepts from around the world in the attempt to answer this mystery, and even how they may be related to the mythical Atlantis. In the Gold Museum in Bogota, Colombia, there are housed a number of interesting ceramic and golden figurines known as the Quimbaya artifacts. These artifacts are believed to have originated during the classical period of the Quimbaya civilization circa 500 BC, 600 AD. These Quimbaya was one of many pre-Columbian cultures inhabiting the Middle Cauca River Valley and southern Antioquian region of modern-day Colombia. The relics are one of a number of what are called out-of-place artifacts from the ancient world. Out-of-place artifacts challenge the historical record in some way and often seem too advanced for the particular civilization and time period to which they are attributed. Mainstream archaeologists described the curious ornaments as zoomorphic models, meaning symbolic of animal forms. The artifacts measure 2 to 3 inches each and are believed to be designed after the likenesses of birds, fish, insects, and other animals from that region during the time. However, closer inspections have led some to argue that some of the figurines resemble modern aircraft. Hence, alternative historians have dubbed them ancient airplanes. Animal symbolism may sound more reasonable at first glance. However, one must admit that the objects possess additional structural features which biological flying creatures do not possess. These include apparent vertical and horizontal stabilizers. Other researchers, such as YouTuber Praveen Mohan, also note that the wings of the Quimbaya relics are attached to the bottoms of the bodies rather than near the tops as is seen in real birds. Mohan also notes the differences between artifacts meant to actually represent birds and the Quimbaya articles. Additionally, in 1994, 2 German aeronautical engineers by the names of Peter Belting and Konrad Lovers used the shapes and dimensions of the Quimbaya artifacts to create large-scale radio-controlled models of them. They proved successful in preliminary flight testing with either propeller power and jet power. Needless to say, these curious artifacts and the region in which they were found deserve much more study. Another even more curious, out-of-place artifact includes the mysterious hieroglyphs in Seti I's temple in Abydos, Egypt. A close look at these strange symbols dated to well over 3,000 years ago seem to depict modern, mechanized conveyances, specifically a helicopter, a tank, a blimp, and what looks like some type of low-flying glider or ground effect machine. But how could this be? Could these devices have existed so many centuries ago? Or is there have some other, more conventional explanation? Did ancient Egypt have its own Leonardo da Vinci? We know that da Vinci designed a number of futuristic machines centuries before they were actually realized, such as the ornithopter, a type of machine designed to achieve and maintain flight by means of flapping wings. He also conceptualized a submarine and a tank, among other visionary concepts. But da Vinci was literally centuries ahead of his time, as it appears that it wasn't until the 1800s that engineers developed working models of ornithopters. Using da Vinci's designs as inspiration, various powering methods including rubber bands, gunpowder charges, springs, steam, and compressed air were used with varying degrees of success to flap the wings for flight. It has been over 500 years since da Vinci, and there have been numerous other polymaths since. And so, it is certainly reasonable to assume that many such futurist visionaries existed over ancient Egypt's more than 3,000-year history. Is this the answer to these fascinating glyphs? Or is there an even simpler explanation? Well, the prevailing mainstream idea is that the curious glyphs are merely the result of random superposition of one pharaoh's glyphs over another. It is known that the Egyptian pharaohs had the tendency to usurp the written legacies and monuments of previous rulers, and one of the ways they did this was via a combination of etching and blotting out the existing glyphs and writing over them, in effect rewriting history. According to this line of thought, the vehicles depicted are simply the result of pareidolia, the tendency for people to mentally impose order and form onto that which is random and formless, to find meaning within chaos. Seeing faces in the clouds is one of the most well-known examples of this scenario. But is this really the simplest and most logical explanation? Some have asked the probability of 4 separate technological images being derived from the random superposition of 2 pharaohs' glyphs, in this case, those of Seti I and Ramses II. Now, it might be reasonable if the overlap resulted in only one seemingly technological device. But to obtain 4 might seem to push the limits of random probability. The ambiguity might be even further compounded when factoring in other ancient out-of-place oddities from around the world, such as the Quimbaya artifacts. Is it likely that all of these artifacts are only interesting coincidences? Or is it more likely that they are reflecting ideas that are much older than we ever thought possible? Do these relics depict concepts going back to as far as the fabled Atlantis? Scaled up, mechanized versions of the Quimbaya artifacts as well as variations of Da Vinci's ornithopters have been shown to be aerodynamically viable. Modifications of these historic devices could at least be tested. But what about the Seti I glyphs? Though they do resemble modern vehicles, a more down-to-earth explanation of their formation has been given. But what if it were possible that the temple's out-of-place glyphs are a clever variation of an ambigram? Ambigrams are composites of glyphs that yield different meanings depending on the orientation or focus of the observation. In the case of the Seti I glyphs, the symbols would form together to create not only statements in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but would also hide what we would consider incredible futuristic concepts in plain sight. It isn't exactly unheard of. But it would raise the question as to why someone would do this. As crazy as it may seem, there have been claims that Da Vinci also cleverly hid secret codes and meanings into his already incredible works. Was an Egyptian Da Vinci-like polymath during the time of Ramses II or after the creator of these curious glyphs? And if so, what would be the purpose of using superimposing glyphs to express advanced concepts instead of just showcasing them outright? But then again, we could ask Da Vinci or any other artist who hides things in plain sight the same question to which we may or may not get a direct answer. But assuming that hidden concepts were actually the intention, then is there any other artifacts from Egypt which may back up the assertion that these glyphs represent advanced concepts of machinery? Concerning this, there is actually another artifact known as the Saqqara bird, which is dated to over 1,000 years later. The Saqqara is a bird-shaped relic made of sycamore wood. Like the Quimbaya artifacts, it is obviously inspired by natural birds, but at the same time, it does not resemble an actual living bird. And as with the Quimbaya relics, we know that the Egyptians' artists could indeed create sculptures of birds which were much more lifelike than the Saqqara bird. So, why create art that looks so unlifelike? The Saqqara actually looks much more like a glider than a biological bird. The main clue is the tail, which was apparently molded into a vertical stabilizer. Some theorists even believe that at some point there was a horizontal stabilizer attachment, which was subsequently lost. Birds do have horizontally oriented tail feathers for assistance with certain aspects of flight. However, they do not have a vertical structure of feathers. Horizontal and vertical stabilizers of the manner as those used in airplanes are not needed as birds use wingtip aerodynamics instead for the majority of flight control. The same argument can be made for the Quimbaya artifacts. So, we must ultimately ask if the Saqqara artifact represents greater knowledge that the ancient Egyptians already had or knowledge which was being actively sought. Does it represent some already fully realized mechanized device in Egypt, such as an ancient aircraft? Or was it only a protoglider used to demonstrate an emerging understanding and expression of flight principles, such as was the case with Da Vinci's designs, which were also considered futuristic for his time? These are very interesting questions. Perhaps we can look at some other proposed claims of ancient flight. Anyone who has researched alternative science and history has probably heard of the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines are a megalithic group of glyphs etched into the desert floor of southern Peru. They date to between 500 BC and 500 AD and were created by making depressions and incisions in the Nazca desert floor and removing the pebbles and dirt. This left the different colored dirt underneath exposed. Many of the lines are straight, but others help to form a variety of geometrical shapes such as triangles, trapezoids, spirals, and even giant creature forms such as a monkey, a hummingbird, and a spider. The overall meanings of these lines and figures are still shrouded in mystery. Among the many theories for them are visual location markings for underground water routes, religious walking paths, and even messages to the gods. Probably the greatest mystery associated with the astonishing geoglyphs is that they cannot be fully appreciated from ground level. Only from the air are they revealed in their full splendor. And so, this inevitably brings up the question of how they could even have been created from only a ground perspective, especially with such skill. Certainly not to say that it is totally impossible. We know that it is indeed possible to hoax a crop circle, even a fairly complex one. And so, it is feasible that the Nazca symbols could have been carved in a similar manner. Temporary structures could even have been constructed for the designers to climb up on and direct their line's creation as well. These more grounded explanations are certainly reasonable, but like crop circles, the Nazca lines seem as though they were meant to be observed from the sky or at least from a much more elevated position. There seems to be no evidence of permanent high structures such as watchtowers, castles, or high walls that once existed in the area. There are nearby mountains from which the glyphs could have been better observed, but it is doubtful that they could have been used to aid in the design of the geoglyphs as they are still a significant distance away. It would seem that the large symbols can only be fully appreciated from the air directly above rather than from the sloped peaks of mountains, which, while high enough, would only allow viewing from a considerable angle. Is it possible that the Nazca had some other way of elevating themselves far above the flat desert floor? And was this elevated position used not only to observe the lines, but also to help create them? Since it is generally assumed that the ancients knew nothing of flight, then this is where the lines are often attributed to aliens or assistance from aliens. If some type of craft was used for such a purpose, then it would have to have been capable of steady hovering in place for it to have been used to direct such intricate work on the ground. But does that automatically mean that the alleged craft has to be an alien spaceship? Could the craft instead have been an Earth-made hot air balloon? Like with the previously mentioned Quimbaya and Egyptian relics, is it possible that hot air balloons large enough to carry people were developed and deployed centuries earlier than currently acknowledged? An article here points to this very possibility. It says here that a researcher by the name of Jim Woodman theorized that at the very least, construction of hot air balloons would have been possible with materials available to the Nazca at that time period. To test this possibility, Woodman contacted Julian Knott, a British balloonist, and presented him with his theory. Knott, himself a pioneer of balloon technology, was noted for several innovations in the field such as hybrid energy and superpressure balloons. Knott and Woodman successfully built and tested a balloon that could have also been developed by the Nazca over a millennium ago, though he readily admitted that there was no direct evidence of this as of yet. But he was adamant that it is beyond doubt that they could have flown in this manner. And so, if the Nazca could build hot air balloons, then it is certainly conceivable that other civilizations such as the Egyptians, the Sumerians, and the Atlanteans could have as well. Knott says, with just a loom and fire you can fly. No modern space-age materials required. Author Shirley Andrews actually mentions lighter-than-air balloons in her book on Atlantis, Insights from a Lost Civilization. In it, she claims that Atlanteans constructed large balloons from animal skins and filled them with hot air and other gases in order to float a short distance above the Earth. Interestingly, these balloons were often created in the shapes of animals. So, it's certainly interesting that we're talking about balloon contraptions helping the Nazca to draw large animal shapes on the desert floor. But are there any other, more palpable implications suggesting that the peoples of the distant past understood and utilized the principles of flight using the natural buoyancy of hot air? Actually, there is an interesting event celebrated by the Chinese called the Lantern Festival. This festival, also called Shangyuan Festival, is a traditional festival celebrated on the 15th day of the first month in the lunisolar Chinese calendar during the full moon. It says here that during the Lantern Festival, children go out at night carrying paper lanterns and solve riddles on the lanterns. In ancient times, the lanterns were fairly simple, and only the emperor and noblemen had large, ornate ones. In modern times, lanterns have been embellished with many complex designs. For example, lanterns are now often made in the shape of animals. Animal shapes are again particularly interesting because variations of these lanterns can be made to float high into the sky, just as with the animal-shaped balloons which floated in the skies of Atlantis, according to Shirley Andrews. It's practically the same theme. We may have seen these fascinating flying contraptions in promotions of what are called night lights events, such as the one shown here. These luminous events are known by different names, including Sky Lantern and Rise Lantern festivals, and as we can see, they can be quite breathtaking. The article gives further insight into this tradition, saying that the lanterns can symbolize the people letting go of their past selves and getting new ones. But given our current study, the most fascinating characteristic about some of these paper lanterns is their ability to fly. These sky lanterns, also known as combing lantern or Chinese lantern, are essentially small hot air balloons made of paper, with an opening at the bottom where a small fire is suspended. Sky lanterns have been made for centuries in many cultures around the world, including much of Asia, Portugal, and Brazil. They were launched for play or as part of long-established festivities, such as the Lantern Festival. The name Sky Lantern is a translation of the Chinese name, but they have also been referred to as sky candles or fire balloons. Initially, they were used as a means of communication in the military and in warfare. However, with the passage of time, their use shifted to symbolizing family reunion and other sentimental themes. A common theme in history, we see how warfare has been one of the key drivers of innovation throughout civilization, generating production of technologies which become non-military mainstays later on in regular society. Though beautiful and fascinating, the lanterns, being powered by fires and floating great distances, are inherently dangerous and thus are outlawed outside of allocated areas, times, and events like the festivals. Certainly, someone in the past would have eventually considered making supersized versions with better materials large enough to carry people. It simply follows that a natural progression of the technology would occur in any age just as in our own. It is believed that the first lantern festivals may date back to at least 2,200 years ago during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, a time period which even coincides with the beginning of the Nazca civilization. Hence, it is very probable that the original concept of the sky lantern itself and its fabric counterpart, the hot air balloon, could go back even further into antiquity. So, perhaps the theory of hot air balloons being used during the time of the Nazca is not so ridiculous after all. Perhaps it is also not so far-fetched that other forms of flight, such as gliders and aircraft, could have been in use as well. We should be able to imagine clever persons creating strap-on winged contraptions onto their bodies and noticing a feeling of lift when running or standing in high winds. The next step would be to run and jump off steeper and steeper elevations or gradients, learning more and more of the principles of flight as time went on. Even children might naturally think to do this after observations of birds flying, or even after hearing entertaining native stories of birdmen by their elders. So certainly, it is not beyond the capabilities of generations of innovative adults. At some point, it might only be a matter of adding a suitable power source, even if it resulted only in momentary flight. Going back to Shirley Andrews' book on Atlantis, she describes some flying crafts as having the structural characteristics of both airplanes and boats, and able to travel on water as well as in the air. These crafts could carry 1 to 2 people and were allegedly energized by rays from some kind of powerful crystal and flew 2 to 3 feet above the ground, similar to Star Wars land speeders. There were also larger crafts which could fly much higher. These ships were called relics and varied in size from 25 feet to more than 300 feet. It says here that they resembled hollow needles with sharp points at each end and were constructed from sheets of bright, lightweight metal that shone in the dark. These passenger vehicles had windows in the floor and along the sides in rows like portholes and skylights in the ceilings. Books, musical instruments, potted plants, comfortable chairs, and beds made traveling a pleasure. A special repulse key enabled the planes to avoid accidental encounters with mountain tops during storms. The article here gives actual technical details on these Atlantean airships. The material of which the airboats were constructed was either wood or metal. The earlier ones were built of wood, the boards used being exceedingly thin, but the injection of some substance which did not add materially to the weight, while it gave leather-like toughness, provided the necessary combination of lightness and strength. When metal was used, it was generally an alloy two white-colored metals, and one red, one entering into its composition. The resultant was white-colored, like aluminum and even lighter in weight. Over the rough framework of the airboat was extended a large sheet of this metal, which was then beaten into shape and electrically welded where necessary. But whether built of metal or with their outside surface was apparently seamless and perfectly smooth, and they shone in the dark as if coated with luminous paint. In shape they were boat-like, but they were invariably decked over, for when at full speed it could not have been convenient, or safe for any on board to remain on the upper deck. Their propelling and steering gear could be brought into use at either end. One of the most interesting features of these alleged crafts was the propulsion system. They were said to have been lifted and propelled by a force which, though generated in what is to us an unknown manner, operated nevertheless through definite mechanical arrangements. This force was similar to, if not the same as, that which John W. Keely in America used to handle, and was etheric in nature, but though we are no nearer to the solution of this problem, its method of operation and layout is described. A strong heavy metal chest which lay in the center of the boat was the generator. Thence the force flowed through two large flexible tubes to either end of the vessel, as well as through 8 subsidiary tubes fixed fore and aft to the bulwarks. These had double openings pointing vertically both up and down. When the journey was about to begin, the valves of the 8 bulwark tubes, which pointed downwards, were opened, all the other valves being closed. The current rushing through these impinged on the earth with such force as to drive the boat upwards, while the air itself continued to supply the necessary fulcrum. When a sufficient elevation was reached, the flexible tube at that end of the vessel, which pointed away from the desired destination, was brought into action. While by the partial closing of the valves, the current rushing through the 8 vertical tubes was reduced to the small amount required to maintain the elevation reached. The great volume of current, being now directed through the large tube pointing downwards from the stern at an angle of about 45 degrees, while helping to maintain the elevation, provided also the great motive power to propel the vessel through the air. The steering was accomplished by the discharge of the current through this tube, for the slightest change in its direction at once caused an alteration in the vessel's course. The maximum speed attained was about 100 miles an hour, the course of flight never being a straight line, but always in the form of long waves. And so, what we have is a description of a vertical takeoff aircraft. This current, which spewed directly downward from the craft, generated the force to lift the craft from the ground. Once in the air, the current was then slightly angled in order to propel the craft forward. In the article here, we see a reference to Philadelphian inventor John W. Keely and how the etheric force he allegedly harnessed was likely the same force used by some of the Atlantean airships, but perhaps in an even more advanced form. But according to the literature, Keely's work was twofold. His earlier work consisted of liberating what he called the aforementioned etheric vapor from a mixture of air and water using acoustic vibrations. Apparently, this vapor was far superior to both steam and compressed air. Keely allegedly used this vapor to operate levers, lift heavy weights, and even to develop an etheric cannon which could shoot projectiles with incredible force. He also attempted to harness the vapor to turn powerful motors. However, he evidently found it impossible to derive continuous rotary motion from using the ether. Thus, The latter phase of his work involved abandoning the use of acoustic vibrations to liberate the vapor and instead attempting to generate motion directly from the vibrations themselves. Since the etheric current described in this account is similar to the force used in Keely's earlier work, then does this mean that acoustic generators aboard the Atlantean ships atomized a supply of water into a continuous flow of powerful etheric current in order to lift and propel the ships? Another curious detail in this account is its reference to using the air as a fulcrum. As we know, a fulcrum is the load-bearing pivot point of a system about which moments, arms, or levers are balanced. Balance is vital in any type of lift, including aerodynamic lift. And so, how could the air function as a fulcrum? This would only seem to make sense if the aircraft possessed wings or was in the shape of an airfoil being a shaped surface, such as an airplane wing, tail, or propeller blade, that produces lift and drag when moved through the air. And so, if this craft did have wings, then its interaction with the air would make them one of the load-bearing structures when moving forward at an adequate speed. In this way, the air would provide the load-bearing fulcrum with the wing box as the contact point. And as the craft moved forward in the atmosphere, it would gain greater lifting power and additional height due to the principles of aerodynamic lift. Lifting power and the loads within a craft have to be in good balance in order for it to fly effectively. In fact, balance is of primary importance in any kind of aircraft and is featured heavily in all aviation training. The article here explains further, saying that the crux of aerodynamic weight and balance is that the center of gravity of a plane needs to be balanced at the center of lift. A plane's balance is similar to traditional fulcrum equations in physics. Think of a seesaw on a playground. The weights of two people need to be distributed evenly across the platform to remain parallel to the ground. A plane's fulcrum in flight is the center of lift, and the distances of the major weights on the aircraft, fuel, passengers, cargo, are referred to as their moment arms. A moment arm is the weight of a balanced object multiplied by its distance from the fulcrum. A 10-kilogram box sitting on a lever 2 meters from the fulcrum would have a moment arm of 20 units. Likewise, a 2-kilogram box 10 meters from the fulcrum on the other side of the lever would produce 20 units. These two objects would balance each other. The center of lift for an aircraft is the sum of the lift forces on the wing box, which forms the structural center of the wings, the fuselage, and the horizontal stabilizer. Though the wing box is the primary load-carrying structure and hence can be represented as the fulcrum. A plane's weight is constantly pulled towards the Earth's gravitational effect. This is true whether the aircraft is on the ground or in the air. The weight of a plane is ever-changing during operation because of how much fuel is burned. A plane's weight changes drastically as it moves. The weight and balance calculation is thus a dynamic one. The changing weight of an aircraft in flight is considered before it ever leaves the ground. The elevator, or horizontal stabilizer, provides downforce to balance the lift generated by the wings. Pilots move their controls back during a climb, and the elevator deflects upward. This reduces the elevator's aerodynamic downforce and allows the plane to climb. The Atlantean airship document goes on to explain that the elevation at which the vessels traveled was only a few hundred feet indeed. When high mountains lay in the line of their track, it was necessary to change their course and go round them, the more rarefied air no longer supplying the necessary fulcrum. Just as with any modern aircraft, the height at which it could fly was limited due to there being less air and hence less aerodynamic lift at higher elevations. Hills of about 1,000 feet were the highest they could cross. And so, we can see that the description of these alleged crafts seems to coincide with well-known aviation principles. These principles would apply whether the conveyances were high-flying or low-flying crafts. The description of this particular craft was apparently the high-altitude one that Shirley Andrews's book describes, but others flew at much lower altitudes of only a few feet above the ground. These particular craft seem to be describing what are called ground effect machines, flying crafts which achieve elevation via both aerodynamic lift as well as some repulsive reaction with the ground or surface beneath it. Ground effect in low-flying crafts is important as we know that high-flying craft can be affected by turbulence. Turbulence is caused by irregular air currents which can make a plane shake or drop suddenly. At high altitudes, these kinds of sudden drops are jarring but are otherwise not too problematic. But close to the ground, it could be catastrophic as the craft could suddenly drop right into the ground. Therefore, some kind of ground or surface effect is necessary. When the wings are close enough to the ground or water, additional positive pressure builds up beneath the wings. This is because the air is effectively squeezed between the wings and the ground or water, hence the term ground or surface effect. But this effect can also be generated by some type of actively repulsive feature as well. One of the most common examples of active ground effect is the hovercraft. A hovercraft is an air cushion vehicle using a flexible skirt to contain a bubble of pressurized air for the vehicle to sit on. However, they have a number of limitations such as not being able to operate on porous ground, such as shingle travel in fields with crops, such as wheat or barley traverse sudden level changes, such as from a mud flat to a water channel in an estuary exceed the speed where the hull experiences aerodynamic lift that exceeds its weight. If you do, the craft lifts at the front and then flips onto its side, but with correctly designed airfoils and control surfaces, these limitations disappear. The modern hoverwing comes to mind here. This type of craft is a hybrid of a hovercraft and a glider. The closer the wings are to the surface underneath, the greater the ground effect pressure. This effect is added to the already positive pressure of the hovercraft's lift fans, which also reacts against the ground at lower altitudes. As the craft gains speed, it gains elevation. This seems to almost perfectly describe the low-flying crafts described in Andrew's book. The previously reviewed Atlantean airship document describes a powerful etheric current as the active lifting force. The current also provided horizontal propulsion, and whether the craft had airfoils or its hull shaped as one, the craft would have achieved additional lift and height beyond what the downward current alone would have generated. At full speed, the current could probably even be reduced to conserve energy. Ground/surface effect for low-altitude aircrafts could also be achieved in other ways. Acoustic or sonic lubrication is one such way. It occurs when sound, measurable in a vacuum by placing a microphone on one element of the sliding system, permits vibration to introduce separation between the sliding faces. This could happen between two plates or between a series of particles. The frequency of sound required to induce optimal vibration and thus cause sonic lubrication varies with the size of the particles. High frequencies will have the desired or undesired effect on sand, and lower frequencies will have this effect on boulders. And so, with acoustic lubrication, there is an actual separation between two sliding surfaces when subjected to vibration. This essentially means that acoustic lubrication is a form of pseudosonic levitation. In addition to acoustic lubrication, vibrational energy can also give rise to a hovercraft-like property called the squeeze effect or squeeze film levitation, or SFEL. It says here that squeeze film levitation occurs when the object to be floated is located adjacent to a vibrating structure. However, it is the viscosity and compressibility of a thin film of air, hence the name squeeze film, that is trapped between the two surfaces, namely the vibrating surface and floating object. That is the basis of squeeze film levitation rather than sound pressure alone. Squeeze film levitation occurs when a flat item is located above an oscillating structure. A basic physical realization of squeeze film levitation comprises an elastic plate, piezoelectric actuators, and a levitated object with air gap. We recall that the previously mentioned etheric current of the relics provided forward propulsion in addition to lift. In a variation of the relics craft, perhaps we could envision acoustic vibrations instead providing the lift via acoustic lubrication while simultaneously liberating ether from a mixture of air and water for forward propulsion. The lift from the vibrations through acoustic lubrication or the squeeze effect would be very small. But again, wings mounted on the vehicle would generate additional lift as the craft picked up speed, perhaps increasing the lift height from just a few centimeters to a couple feet or more. But an even more advanced acoustic airship was allegedly developed by John Keely and demonstrated for the U.S. War Department in 1896. It says here that, in attendance at the demonstration were a number of invited members of the press. Descriptions of the craft state that it was a circular platform roughly 6 feet in diameter. On this platform was mounted a small stool set before a keyboard. The keyboard was attached to numerous tuned resonation plates and vibratory mechanisms. Mr. Keely explained that these plates would cause the craft to rise and float above the ground when subjected to a polarized field which would generate a negative attraction. When the effect was produced, the craft would come under the influence of what Keely referred to as the etheric polar current. The controlling mechanism consisted of a row of 100 vibratory bars representing the enharmonic and diatonic scales. When half of the bars were damped, the craft would move at 500 miles per hour. If all the bars were damped, gravity would resume control and the craft would settle to the earth. Note, obviously these bars are not the main generators of the sound vibrations. They only change the way the vibrations are flowing through the device by their resonance. Dampening certain bars allowed Keely to make slight changes in the direction of the flow in the CU that was surrounding the craft, thus changing how the craft traveled through Earth's gravity. CU stands for consciousness unit. An alternate term is vacuum domain, or VD. This consciousness unit or vacuum domain is said to open a gateway or conduit for the higher pressure ether energy to stream into our physical world, much as a hole in the side of a water tank will cause the water to come rushing out. Gravity waves, which normally press into the earth, are absorbed and transformed into electromagnetism and visible light within these objects. These conduits commonly take up the form of a glowing, rotating sphere of light with a hole that passes through its center, making it look somewhat like an apple, a donut, or the inside of an orange. The technical name for the shape is a spherical torus. Once a VD is created, anti-gravity effects can be produced, as well as free energy. It goes on to say here that there were no moving parts in the ship's propelling mechanism. Note, however, it is still producing a polarized field, somehow to create the main vibrations that allow it to levitate. It was unaffected by weather and could rise above any storm. The instrument for guiding the airship was distinctly different from the propelling feature. By damping out certain specific notes, Keely could cause the airship to accelerate to any desired speed. The experiment was carried out in an open field with observers from the War Department and news media. The ship was said to have accelerated from 0 to 500 miles per hour within a few seconds. Most astounding was the apparent total lack of acceleration effects to Mr. Keely as he sat on the stool before the keyboard, controlling the airship. Another source says that, in Keely's airship demonstration to the U.S. War Department, reports were that although he flew his machine in the open air at speeds up to 500 miles per hour, when he returned, not a hair was mussed. Nor was he in the least disheveled, which would normally be the case if openly exposed to high-velocity winds. This indicates the establishment of a bubble of force that protected anyone within its confines. Rather, it produced a center of gravity that absorbed ether at its own rate, rather than being chained to the planet. Thus, inertia and gravity were solely governed by itself. Keely said you could produce this effect to such a degree that the object would float away like a bubble, independent of the mass, referring to the Earth. This incredible description of Keely's airship seems to describe a true anti-gravity type conveyance, complete with the protection from inertial effects of rapid acceleration and deceleration, which we often hear about as being one of the main hallmarks of UFOs. Even the Atlantean Relics seems to lack this particular feature, as looking back at the article here, being exposed to the elements at top speed would have been deemed unsafe. So, it seems that the Relics craft, while employing a novel source of ether, did not operate via anti-gravity, but instead solely by the propellant force of downwardly directed etheric current. But from what I can gather, even Keely seemed to describe more than one type of levitation. One was akin to a repulsive force akin to magnetic repulsion, while the other in its description sounds less reactionary and appears to characterize the nature of the airship demonstrated for the U.S. War Department. This method allows a craft to be lifted and propelled by riding the currents of the Earth's polar stream similarly to a boat being buoyed up and riding on currents of water. See my video, Vibratory Lift Part 2, for detailed information on these two concepts. It is unclear as to whether or not an anti-gravity levitation system would really benefit from airfoils or wings. Indeed, reports of UFOs sometimes describe crafts of practically every conceivable shape, some which are far from aerodynamic. But if the craft doesn't fully levitate and only cancels out a significant portion of the craft's weight, as in gravitational shielding, then wings could be useful. But they would not need to be as large as they would need to be for a craft of similar size and weight, but without the shielding effect. In the book Free Energy Pioneer, author Theo Pagemans discusses an account of phenomena which occurred over a 5-month period in the late 1800s known as the Great 19th Century Airship Wave. During this time period, thousands of people saw UFOs, described as brilliant lights and vague aeroforms, which were nicknamed airships in the press. It says here that all the characteristics of later UFO waves were apparent. There were contacts. Eyewitnesses would often meet the alleged builders of these airships, terrestrial and extraterrestrial, with some who claimed to represent the inventors. There would even be an occasional abduction and tales of crashes and hoaxes. Pagemans further notes that it is, however, significant that the airship wave occurred at a time when Keely was involved in his anti-gravity research and had actually built several devices for his proposed system of aerial navigation. But before we jump to conclusions, it must be taken into account that from the documentation that is at hand, news about Keely's inventions and news about the airship wave were treated by the contemporary press as two separate events. Nowhere in those accounts did I find a reference to each other, either by way of explanation or otherwise. Nevertheless, the timing of these events was interesting as they occurred during Keely's final years and his often publicized work. It was also a time and climate in which interest in human flight was at an all-time high, pardon the pun. Great understandings of aviation principles had been ushered in about 100 years earlier with the work of Sir George Cayley, an English engineer, inventor, and aviator who is recognized as one of the most important people in the history of aeronautics. Many consider him to be the first true scientific aerial investigator and the first person to understand the underlying principles and forces of flight. Cayley began his aviation experiments with what is called the bamboo copter, also known as the bamboo dragonfly or Chinese top. It is a toy helicopter rotor that flies up when its shaft is rapidly spun. It originated in Jin Dynasty China just over 1,700 years ago, specifically around 320 AD. Cayley's construction of a model aeroplane and diagrams of the elements of vertical flight likely invoked hope that human flight would one day be a reality. His and others' developments of early modern flight theory, as well as Keely's later more unconventional theories of aerial navigation, stimulated the imaginations of both the public at large as well as talented fiction writers. The latter half of the 1800s saw the publishing of a number of books which flaunted science fictional elements seemingly inspired by both existing conventional flying contraptions and concepts, as well as Keely's later advanced concepts of vibratory lift. Interestingly, some of these stories featured conveyances with elements of both planes and boats, such as this quote from the 1871 book, The Coming Race, written by English writer and politician Edward Bulwer Lytton. I saw gliding quickly through the air what appeared a small boat, impelled by sails shaped like wings. This particular quote sounds familiar to the alleged Atlantean flying boats mentioned in Shirley Andrews's book. Other flying crafts mentioned during the late 1800s airship wave took other shapes. In Free Energy Pioneer, Pagemans recounts a description of a craft which had the shape of an electrified balloon from within which human voices were distinctly heard. Another craft had flapping wings, which brings to mind Leonardo da Vinci's ornithopter. Another interesting account described a craft which was partially propelled by a hat-shaped parachute which apparently opened up when the ship descended and closed when it ascended. This particular aerial contraption was allegedly built by an unnamed Californian inventor and was apparently mirrored by a contemporary counterpart in New Jersey. The New Jersey airship was said to have been able to glide, but could not remain in the air indefinitely like the former airship. However, it was constructed to be able to land in the water. The book also mentions the existence of entire groups which worked in secret to develop advanced crafts. One was a non-profit secret society known as the Sonora Aero Club. This group financed and developed airships called Aeros, and its members were forbidden to use them for profit or use their principles for military purposes under strict penalty. The source of propulsion for some of these Aeros purportedly made use of a mysterious formula only known as NB gas. This peculiar gas was said to have been not only lighter than air, but also possessed of the ability to actually negate and cancel a portion of a ship's weight. If such is the case, then the designs using this unique gas would have been able to fly with wings much smaller than similar sized and weighted crafts as previously mentioned. Still, other crafts seem to not require wings at all, operating solely on levitational principles similar to Keely's. We may recall the account of Keely's Model 8 pounds airship, which was able to ascend, descend, and float in the air as gently as thistledown. In my video, I Suspend Gravity with a Wire, we were introduced to a reference to a contact case during this same airship wave period in which it was exclaimed that gravity could be overcome by placing a small wire around an object, a concept evocative of Keely's Trexor wire. Please see the just mentioned video for more information on this concept. A link is in the description below. If the stories of these airships are true, then logic would dictate that they were somehow a divergent product of 19th century technology known only to a small select group of people, and resulting in suspension and propulsion methods that were far more advanced than that which was in general use by society at that time. Similar such technological machinations are described in stories which go back to ancient times, such as the Vimanas of India and, as we've seen, back to the claimed super civilization of Atlantis. They might lead some to wonder if the ancients developed technologies and methods which were different from what we possess today, but just as effective. And if so, what are the implications of it? And how can it be proven or at least given more serious consideration by the mainstream? To this effect, there is a little-known story about the attempt in the 70s of Japanese researchers to prove the theory that the pyramids were built simply using primitive tools and methods. The introductory paragraph says that, in 1978, a daring experiment was launched in Egypt to try and replicate the construction techniques of the ancient Egyptians. A team of Japanese researchers set out to build a small replica of the Giza pyramids, but their attempt fell far short due to primitive methods and modern challenges. The article continues saying that, using only primitive tools and techniques, which consisted of cutting stones with chisels and stacking them by lifting ropes and other manual means, a group of Japanese researchers attempted to recreate the construction techniques of the ancient Egyptian pyramids. The team initially planned on using basic tools such as pulleys to move 4-ton stones and construct a 20-meter pyramid. However, the task proved far too difficult and costly for them to complete, so they decided to reduce the size of the pyramid to 10 meters and reduce the weight of the stones from 4 tons to 1 ton. Even then, they had to resort to using electric saws for the cutting process. Transportation was another major challenge for the team. They attempted to use wooden rafts and boats, but these methods all failed. They eventually resorted to flat ships and even laying a railway track along the Nile to move the stones from the Tura limestone quarry to the Giza plateau. But their biggest hurdle came when they tried to transport the stones up to the top of the pyramid. With only 50 workers, they could only move them a few centimeters at a time. In order to finish their project, they had no choice but to use cranes and even a helicopter. Ultimately, their experiment proved unsuccessful in trying to replicate ancient Egyptian pyramid construction techniques. So, as we can see, a model pyramid replica that was only 10 meters high. Nearly 1/14 teach, the height of the 137-meter Great Pyramid proved so difficult that the research team had to resort to using modern 1978 technology. These included electrically powered saws and even a helicopter in order to get the model pyramid built within the allotted time. They even had to use flat ships and even laying a railway track along the Nile to move the stones from Tura to the Giza plateau. Tura is the limestone quarry from which the outer casing stones of the pyramid were hewn. It is not only 15 kilometers or 3 miles away, but also downriver at 62 feet above sea level. This, of course, means that the pyramid builders could not rely on the Nile's natural downward flow to bring the blocks to the pyramid building site, which is 196 feet above sea level. Even if they did bring them in via the Nile, they still would have had to exert energy in order to transport them upriver. The 1978 team had to upgrade from wooden rafts and boats to flat ships, which would have to have been powered in some way. A temporary metal track also had to be laid to transport the heavy stones along parts of the river, and likely from the river to the site. In summary, the team utterly failed to complete the process using the tools and techniques generally ascribed to the peoples of the time. They ultimately had to defer to modern technology. And so, we have to wonder, how is it that people who are supposed to be 5,000 years more advanced would have so much trouble building a model pyramid that was a mere fraction of the real thing? The 1978 team had such difficulty in even quarrying and cutting the stones, let alone transporting them. When we add in the much greater complexity of the Giza pyramids with their precision, orientation, and internal features and substructures, it has to bring into stark question the modern assumption and often insistence that the ancients only had primitive technology, and especially the implication that they were less skilled and less intelligent than we are today. It simply doesn't add up. Some might argue that with larger numbers, more time, and a spare no expense edict issued by an unquestionable, all-powerful ruler would have given the workforce the ability to overcome these limitations. But if 50 workers could only move a 1-ton stone block a few centimeters at a time, then far more people would be needed to set a stone 2.5 times heavier once every 5 minutes in the real Great Pyramid in order to complete the structure in the proposed 20-year period. The logistics of such a construction and an engineering project using only brute force and primitive tools would appear to be strained to the very limits. The development of various means of multiplying the effort of each worker or team with suitable technology, just as we do today, would be far more feasible. The real question would be the basis of this technology. Would it be based on electromagnetism and fossil fuels as with today's technology? Or could it instead have been based on acoustic vibrations, solar and water power, and even steam power? Either way, the 1978 experiment essentially proves that the tools and methods the pyramid builders used would have to have been considerably more advanced than that which is generally attributed to them. With what we know of the megaliths, I would even go so far as to hypothesize a technological level similar to what we had at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution with steam power and other heat engines. As unlikely as it might seem, the basic concept of the heat engine appears to go back as far as prehistory. We see here a device called the fire piston, which in itself is a type of heat engine. Its first known use was in the kindling of fire by ancient Austroasiatic tribes in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Its Malay name is Gobek API and uses the principle of the heating of gas by rapid and adiabatic compression to ignite a piece of tinder and create a fire. We understand this principle today via the ideal gas law, which shows the positive correlation between the pressure of a gas and its temperature. As the temperature of a gas increases, its pressure increases. And similarly, as the pressure of a gas increases, so does its temperature increase. The fire piston proves emphatically that very ancient peoples had practical knowledge of these principles. But as it admits here, the ultimate origin of the technology is unclear and as such could go back even further into time. Is it possible that these tribes retain some of the knowledge from their own ancient ancestors who were perhaps inhabitants of high civilizations? In the video, Ancient Advanced Lighting, we discovered that the Ute tribe of North America made rattles which could produce visible light via the principles of triboluminescence. We also found out that the Ute are descendants of the Aztecs, a high civilization in the Americas during the Middle Ages period. We know that when civilizations fall, their people scatter. Some become absorbed into other empires and societies, while others may revert to a more tribal or nomadic lifestyle. Other examples of this include the Noba people, who are nomadic descendants of the ancient Nubian city-state of Meroe in Africa, and the modern-day descendants of the Inca who live today as peasants and nomads in the Andes Mountains. And so, it follows that as the people scatter, so does remnants of the engineering and other knowledge from their fallen civilizations. And so the question is, does this include a practical knowledge of vibrations, aerodynamics, and thermodynamics? We can clearly see a relation between the fire piston and a Stirling heat engine. The Stirling engine is a type of heat engine which works via external combustion rather than internal combustion. It is also classified as a thermoacoustic engine as a heat differential between a source of heat and an energy sink is converted to work in the alternating compression and decompression of air, thus generating vibrations. Ancient versions of fire pistons are said to have been made from wood, animal horns, antlers, bamboo, or metal. The video clip here shows an indigenous technique for making piston bellows to fuel a fire. The cylinder is made from a tree trunk, the piston from a rod, wooden discs and feathers, and what appears to be some kind of resin to act as an airtight sealant, apparently a method passed down over a very long period of time. A few modifications and more durable materials could turn this device into a heat-powered vibratory engine. This discovery is significant as we've seen that vibrations can indeed be used to cut and carve stones as seen here in the videos, ancient acoustic cutting and ancient acoustic carving respectively. We've also seen that vibrational engines can move and help move massive loads without wheels as in the video, moving boulders with the push of a finger. And in the videos, Ancient Thermoacoustics and Ancient Thermoacoustic Supplemental, we saw that similar vibrational engines could be modified to be powered by heat instead of electricity. As with the Nazca balloon theory, such engines could have been built with the materials believed to have been available to the ancients. Hence, we could see the hypothetical viability of a vibration-based technology in the distant past, perhaps powered by heat energy, what we understand today as thermoacoustics. But returning to the article, it is also interesting that the Japanese team used a helicopter as alternative investigators have proposed that flying devices could have been used in ancient times to help lift and move huge stones. But not only acoustic levitation as the legends seem to imply, but even more conventional aerial devices such as kites. One of the first proponents of the ancient kite theory was Maureen Clemens, a Californian software consultant. It says here that, while perusing a book on the monuments of Egypt, she noticed a hieroglyph that showed a row of men standing in odd postures. They were holding what looked like ropes that led, via some kind of mechanical system, to a giant bird in the sky. She wondered if perhaps the bird was actually a giant kite, and the men were using it to lift a heavy object. Intrigued, Clemens contacted Morteza Garib, aeronautics professor at the California Institute of Technology. He was fascinated by the idea and similarly puzzled by the picture that had sparked Clemens's interest. The object in the sky apparently had wings far too short and wide for a bird and agreed that the possibility certainly existed that it was a kite. And since he needed a summer project for his student Emilio Graf, investigating the possibility of using kites as heavy lifters seemed like a good idea. Garib and Graf set themselves to the task of raising a 4.5-meter stone column from horizontal to vertical, using no source of energy except the wind. Their initial calculations and scale model wind tunnel experiments convinced them they wouldn't need a strong wind to lift the 33.5-ton column. Even a modest force, if sustained over a long time, would do. The key was to use a pulley system that would magnify the applied force. So, they rigged up a tent-shaped scaffold directly above the tip of the horizontal column, with pulleys suspended from the scaffold's apex. The idea was that as one end of the column rose, the base would roll across the ground on a trolley. The team put Clemens's unlikely theory to the test, using a 40-square-meter rectangular nylon sail. The kite lifted the column clean off the ground. We were absolutely stunned, Garib says. The instant the sail opened into the wind, a huge force was generated, and the column was raised to the vertical in a mere 40 seconds. The wind was blowing at a gentle 16 to 20 kilometers an hour, little more than half what they thought would be needed. What they had failed to reckon with was what happened when the kite was opened. There was a huge initial force, 5 times larger than the steady-state force, Garib says. This jerk meant that kites could lift huge, megalithic-level weights. So, Clemens was right. The pyramid, builders could have used kites to lift massive stones into place. Whether they actually did is another matter, Garib says. There are no pictures showing the construction of the pyramids, so there is no way to tell what really happened. The evidence for using kites to move large stones is no better or worse than the evidence for the brute force method, Garib says. Indeed, the experiments have left many specialists unconvinced. The evidence for kite lifting is non-existent, says Willeke Wendrich, an associate professor of Egyptology at the University of California, Los Angeles. This without mentioning that there is little evidence for even the conventional ideas such as thousands of slaves straining human muscle and bone beyond their natural limits, as well as the lack of the fleets of giant wooden sleds and barges said to have been used to help move the largest stones. From what we can determine, no such ancient arsenal of equipment has yet been found. But just because we haven't yet found them doesn't mean that they don't exist. It simply means we haven't found them yet. We must keep in mind that Troy, an entire ancient city, was found only less than 200 years ago in 1871, and the fallen walls of Jericho barely more than 100 years ago in 1911. This may be why others feel there may be real cases for the more unconventional theories, such as vibrations or the kite theory as just described. The article begins its conclusion stating that harnessing the wind would not have been a problem for accomplished sailors like the Egyptians, and they are known to have used wooden pulleys, which could have been made strong enough to bear the weight of massive blocks of stone. In addition, there is some physical evidence that the ancient Egyptians were interested in flight. This leads into the article's particularly interesting mention of the aforementioned Saqqara bird, referring to it as the wooden artifact found on the step pyramid at Saqqara, which looks uncannily like a modern glider. Although it dates from several hundred years after the building of the pyramids, its sophistication suggests that the Egyptians might have been developing ideas of flight over a long period of time. And as with the sky lanterns mentioned earlier, other ancient civilizations certainly knew about kites. It says here that as early as 1250 BC, the Chinese were using kites to deliver messages and to dump flaming debris on their foes. Although some sources date the origin of kites and their probable military use to a much later period between 475 and 221 BC. Thus, it appears that kites had a very similar technological evolution as the sky lantern. As previously mentioned, the sky lantern was likewise originally employed in communication and warfare, and then later adapted to civilian use. The article concludes by pondering that the experiments might even have practical uses nowadays. There are plenty of places around the globe where people have no access to heavy machinery, but do know how to deal with wind, sailing, and basic mechanical principles. Garib has already been contacted by a civil engineer in Nicaragua who wants to put up buildings with adobe roofs supported by concrete arches on a site that heavy equipment can't reach. His idea is to build the arches horizontally, then lift them into place using kites. To add to this, in the video, Gravitational, Gravitic, Levitation, we looked into the theory of what is called the Old Equator. The idea is that just as there were polar shifts in Earth's past, there may also have been an equatorial shift, and has been suggested by a few alternative investigators that many of the ancient megaliths, including the Nazca lines, were developed along this old equator. We know that the ground speed at the equator is about 1,000 miles per hour. This generates levity not just due to centrifugal force directly, but also indirectly due to the equatorial bulge that the force creates. Masses in this region are farther from the Earth's core than masses on other areas on the Earth's surface. Hence, this also has a slight effect on apparent weight, which is compounded to the geocentrifugal effect. Hence, objects at this latitude weigh about 0.5% less than they would at the poles. This levity might have aided any lifting efforts when building large structures, whether using kites, hot air balloons, or levitation devices, just as it is harnessed today when launching rockets from or in proximity to equatorial regions. This assistance due to the Earth's rotation can be significant. A rocket launched from the French Guiana Space Center at only 5 degrees north of the equator can lift an additional 1,200 kilograms or 2,645.5 pounds into orbit than an identical rocket launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome Spaceport in Kazakhstan, which lies at 46 degrees north. So, when it comes to ancient flight technology, we have a number of interesting theories put forth by several investigators, including Peter Belting and Conrad Lubbers, and their work in Quimbaya airplane models. Jim Woodman and Julian Knott, and their theory that the ancient Peruvians could have developed arcane hot air balloons to assist them in creating the Nazca lines, as well as Maureen Clemens, Mortiza Garib, and Emilio Graf and their theory that huge ancient kites may have been employed to help lift huge boulders in antiquity. All of these would be considered fringe theories in the same camp as sonic levitation and the pyramid power plant. However, a major difference between these theories is that the former three theories have been accompanied by rigorous field testing. Beltings and Lubbers' scaled-up Quimbaya planes do in fact fly. Woodman and Knott were successful in creating and flying in hot air balloons made from materials which would have been available to the ancient Nazca. And Garib and Graf put Clemens's ancient kite theory to the test, proving that such a kite, along with a pulley system and guiding scaffold, could not only rather easily raise a 33.5-ton stone column from a horizontal position to a vertical position, but that it could also lift such a mass clear off the ground. With these results, Garib calculated that a 300-ton column could have been similarly lifted to a vertical position with only 40 or so men and 4 to 5 identical kite sails. However, ancient hot air balloons and kites are the most viable ideas as they could have been developed with the materials which even mainstream science can agree would have been available to the peoples of those time periods. The theory that is the most questionable out of the three is that of the Quimbaya planes, since the engineers of course used modern-day electronics and engines to make them fly. And so, though the scaled-up models were shown to be aerodynamically viable, it would still be a question of how these proposed ancient conveyances would have been propelled. Could the Quimbaya artifacts have used some type of ancient propellant to fly under their own power? Or did they operate more akin to glorified hang gliders? To operate a hang glider, one only has to get a running start off of a high hill or cliff. That's it. And as far as steering, it says here that hang gliders are controlled by shifting the pilot's weight with respect to the glider. Pilots are suspended from a hang strap connected to the glider's frame, hence the name hang glider. By moving forward and backward and side to side at the end of this hang strap, the pilot alters the center of gravity of the glider. This then causes the glider to pitch or roll in the direction of the pilot's motion, and thus allows both speed control and turning. Landing a glider is achieved by what is called stalling. A stall is a condition in which the aircraft wing stops producing lift due to an excessive angle of attack. The angle of attack, as shown here, is the angle between the wing's chord line and the oncoming airflow. Conversely, the wing can be made to generate lift by reducing the angle of attack to an appropriate level. In simpler terms, one should slightly elevate the tip of the glider to gradually and simultaneously slow the glider down and reduce lift. The glider can even be slowed down enough that one can do a partial belly landing with assistance from a set of wheels or other impact mitigating landing structures. Looking at the Quimbaya artifacts, their flat bottoms could have provided this type of landing structure. Cushioning on the floor of the cockpit would have allowed for an even softer landing. Today we see airplanes that land with the aid of wheels, but safely landing without wheels is certainly practical as well. Landing on water is a viable technique as well, as we can see here. By modifying the undercarriage of a glider plane into a boat-like hull, the craft could be given this ability to make a soft landing in water, after which onboard oars and paddles could then be used to get the contraption onto shore. Could this be why some of the flying conveyances in the Atlantis narratives and other accounts had characteristics of both airplanes and boats? Of course, such a gliding system would also require that each destination have its own elevated structure so that one could take off from the destination to another or back home. Of course, I wouldn't put it past the ancients to have found a way to add a power system to their gliders, making them into full-fledged airplanes, either via human power, as is described in the following patent of a flapping wing hang glider, which is reminiscent of Da Vinci's ornithopter, or even by some type of propellant. To the latter's effect, a steam-powered aircraft could have even been a possibility. Such craft were heavily experimented with in more recent times during the 19th and 20th centuries, before the advent of the internal combustion engine. Some may question the efficacy of steam to propel an aircraft, but we must remember that even the craft depicted in the Quimbaya artifacts and the flying boats of Atlantis are not huge, multi-ton passenger jets. The former would seem to seat one or perhaps two pilots, while the Atlantean crafts are specifically described as carrying only 2 to 6 passengers in Andrew's book on Atlantis. And as we see with gliders, constant propulsion would not be necessary anyway. The steam jet would only need to generate maximum power for liftoff. A steep slope could aid in obtaining the necessary speed. After the craft is airborne, only intermittent spurts of thrust would be needed to maintain or gain altitude, as the gliding function would take over most of the flight. It would be similar to the coasting function of a car on the freeway. For such a system, then, it would only be necessary to figure out how much total energy is needed for takeoff and periodic thrusts. This would determine the amount of water the craft would have to carry. As far as the needed power, this would depend on how heavy the loaded craft is as well as how steep the takeoff gradient is. The heavier the payload and less steep the takeoff gradient, the more power needed, and therefore the faster the water would have to be converted into steam. Power, as we know, is equivalent to the quotient of energy and time. And so, thrust power would be determined by how fast the water as the energy source is converted into jet steam. In fact, steam-powered jet propeller could provide not only intermittent propulsion, but also acoustic lubrication, as the vibrations could be produced via the kettle whistle effect. This brings into play the principles of thermoacoustics as a possible means to generate powerful acoustic vibrations without electricity and with materials which would have been available in ancient times. Links to my ancient thermoacoustics videos are in the description below. But for a craft sitting on a smooth slope, the resulting acoustic lubrication would allow the steam jet to push the craft downward and forward with much less friction, so that it could not only reach takeoff speed in less time, but also push off with heavier payloads. So, in the final analysis, weather kites to help lift massive monoliths, hot air balloons to guide the creation of geoglyphs, plane boat hybrids, even levitation devices and ground effect machines. Kites are the only devices that don't seem to be specifically referenced as having been in use in Atlantis. They are all feasible methods and, as demonstrated, could have been achieved without what we would call modern, space-age technology. But do they add validity to the claims of legendary technology in Atlantis? As far as the source of these claims, and even much of the material in Andrew's books, many of them apparently come from readings of renowned psychic Edgar Cayce. But was Cayce really psychic? There is considerable evidence that many of his psychic medical diagnoses and predictions of world events were erroneous. And so, what does this say about his claims about Atlantis? Is it possible that he made all of it up, simply adding to Plato's original story? Or is it more likely that he was simply privy to hidden knowledge? Cayce was said to have been a voracious reader and mostly self-taught, being very familiar with the works of Theosophist Helena Blavatsky. Blavatsky in turn claimed to have received the bulk of her knowledge and insight from a group of spiritual adepts whom she referred to as the masters of the ancient wisdom. These masters were flesh and blood people who were said to have accumulated and preserved a great storehouse of information going all of the way back to distant antiquity as well as the non-physical realms. Not to outright dismiss psychic phenomena, but is it possible that some of this ancient knowledge was the true source of Edgar Cayce's insights rather than any psychic prowess? Is this information kept in the annals of the most secret of secret societies? And was Cayce a member of these societies? We certainly know how difficult it can be for human beings to keep secrets, especially big ones. And so, secret keepers may at times seek to unburden themselves by divulging some of this hidden information in ways that would be difficult to trace back to themselves and their groups as the source. Is it possible that one way to do this would be to occasionally employ individuals such as Blavatsky, Cayce, and others to present or leak select aspects of hidden information in cryptic form through writings, false remote viewings, and fake psychic visions? In modern times, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media can be even more effectively employed for this purpose. Revealing hidden information in this way would render it a completely safe and open secret. It would be an ingenious way to divulge select information which some people would readily grasp as hidden truths, while others would just as quickly dismiss it as being only clever and interesting entertainment. And so, what do we really make of all of this? Do these stories and ambiguous artifacts really point back to an ancient aerodynamic technology and an advanced civilization capable of creating it? Atlantis, or the culture that Atlantis was based on, would have been as ancient to the Egyptians and Sumerians as the Egyptians and Sumerians are to us. But with Atlantis' destruction, its people and much of its knowledge would have been lost as well, except for the few who were said to have escaped, passing on stories of the once great empire and fragments of its culture and technology. Did the peoples of Egypt and Sumer wonder how Atlantis came to be just as we wonder how the pyramids were built? Did anecdotal accounts of Atlantis's technology inspire later ancient peoples who were then able to partially regain some of that lost knowledge? Perhaps we could envision a scenario in which 10 brilliant male and female engineers are on board a small plane and flying over a vast and extremely remote wilderness, headed towards a science exhibition. Their plane malfunctions and begins to descend from the sky, crashing into the wilderness. They all survive without serious injury, but the plane is damaged beyond repair. Salvaging what they can from the wreckage of the plane, they venture out into the dense woods. Using their extensive knowledge of mechanics, they create a winch, hoists, levers, and a crane from wood and the barely operable plane engine to move large weights around. They create flashlights to see at night, and even some makeshift radio transmitters to try to signal someone concerning their location so that they can be rescued. But since their location is so remote, they know that chances of any immediate rescue are slim. They can, however, communicate with each other. They go about their lives for the time being, using the mechanical devices they built to create long-lasting, sturdy structures out of stone and the wood of massive trees. With their electronics expertise, they are also able to create a small number of useful gadgets and devices to assist them in their daily lives. But of course, they can't build anywhere near on the same level and quality that they could back in civilization when they had access to state-of-the-art lab equipment such as lasers and 3D printers. They don't even have access to the virtual libraries provided by the internet. So, all the knowledge they use has to be derived from memory and whatever notes they may have had on hand from their trip. Eventually, they pair up and have children, passing on everything that they know and how they built their structures. They even tell them stories about the great cities they came from and the fabulous machinery and technology they once had access to. So, the question is, has a similar scenario played out on a larger, perhaps global scale in antiquity? Was there a proto-civilization which was in some ways similar to ours and developed over many centuries, but which was subsequently destroyed and scattered by a worldwide cataclysm? And does this scenario depict one of several such creation and destruction cycles, with our current civilization being only the latest of them? Even if so, small remnants of these civilizations and some of their concepts would survive, and stories of them passed on in both stories and also in secret traditions. And of course, some of even the most secret of secrets will occasionally manifest themselves either via stories or material culture, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Does this help to explain the Quimbaya artifacts, the Saqqara bird, and apparent evidence of seemingly uncontemporary, advanced machining in the ancient world? The Atlantean planes and levitation devices may be long gone. But did some of the knowledge of these devices' operating principles survive? And was this knowledge used to help build some of the later structures like the pyramids or Baalbek, structures perhaps not as grand as those of Atlantis, but still mysteriously ahead of their time? Did airplanes, airships, kites, and hot air balloons grace the skies of antiquity? Or did they only grace the imaginations of ancient futurists? Ancient futurism may seem like a misnomer or contradiction, but humans of every age have always envisioned a better future filled with things and abilities previously thought impossible. Possibilities inspired by both raw imagination and inventiveness, as well as stories of things and places which may or may not have actually existed. In order to survive and thrive on Earth, humanity has always had to do three things: invent, innovate, and migrate. Therefore, we've always striven to develop new concepts and bring those concepts and ideas into fruition. This is true not only of the last 500 to 600 years, or even the last 2000, but for as long as humanity has existed. The last 100 years has seen great strides. Did similar strides also occur in the distant past? Thanks for watching. And as always, stay tuned.